something that we like to call vendor bullying, or in our case, more specifically, MarTech vendor bullying.
These vendors, although they talk about a personal relationship, the reality is that they are, like many companies, revenue optimizers, and they will try to optimize their revenue off you.
The classic one is FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt tactics, saying like, if you don't renew with us right now, you're going to lose all your data.
What the hell do I do about it? How do I inoculate myself? What do I do, if this happens?
Welcome to Real Story on MarTech. Ruthless advocates for your MarTech mission. Advising buyers with just the facts on stacks to get you on the right track.
Hey everyone, welcome to Real Story on MarTech podcast. I'm Jarrod, Gingras, Managing Director of the Real Story Group.
Hey, and I'm Tony, Byrne, the founder of Real Story Group.
And for those of you unfamiliar with Real Story Group, we're an industry analyst firm that follows a number of different MarTech marketplaces. And then what we do is we evaluate different vendors on their strengths and maybe more importantly, their weaknesses to help you all make the best decisions for what you're trying to do. Tony, we selected vendor bullying as our topic for today because, quite frankly, this is something we've seen over the last few decades, but it's certainly coming back into prominence on an everyday conversation perspective. We're hearing from clients and prospective clients, hey, there's something here that we need to address.
Yeah, it's been a through line for the whole 2 decades we've been working on it, but it feels like it's just rising to a crescendo right now as people are figuring out the future of their stack. So, we picked this for our first episode because it has a lot of impact. There's a lot of risks for you, but also potentially some upside if you can fight it off.
Yeah, and unfortunately, I think some things can kind of trigger the rise of vendor bullying. We saw kind of a spike right before the pandemic, where everyone was kind of really getting nervous, about where their next commission check was going to come from. And I worry about the uncertainty with the economy now as we're starting to see a little bit of an uptick again. So that's why we thought today would be a good time to readdress the topic and kind of dig into it a little bit more in some more detail.
Yeah, I think, you definitely see more of it during macroeconomic turbulence, but there's also, I think, some stack turbulence that's going on as well. I think there are some fundamental questions that MarTech stack leaders are asking about their tool sets and how it all fits together. And larger vendors in particular, have a particular story around this that's kind of amenable, I would say, to kind of bullying. And this really matters for enterprise decision makers because now more than ever, you want to make sure you've got the right fit, but also that you maintain, we would argue, a composable MarTech stack. And a lot of the bullying is around not having a composable MarTech stack.
So let's get into this, Tony, and I want to start by kind of level setting here about what we consider vendor bullying, because we're not talking about traditional sales tactics. We know that sales is a cutthroat game. It's, there's a lot of tricks of the trade that are out there, and we know that salespeople need to feed their families, and where they need to do their job. We're not talking about that. What we're talking about is when those tactics kind of cross a line into something else that is just one of those things when you see it, but let's help our listeners understand how do we define this?
I mean, it's several things, and we'll get into that in a minute. I mean, it's when they're not necessarily making a value proposition to the team that actually has to implement and run the software itself. As you said, there's normal to have assertive sales tactics. I think bullying it's more kind of like it when you see it, but a big part of it is when they kind of go up and over your head. And we'll talk about that in a minute. But I think one of the things that I'll just say a little bit on behalf of the vendors is that it's normal for them to want to talk to actual enterprise decision makers, right? So it is really important whenever you build a selection team to articulate, hey, these are the decision makers. They're going to be the ones at a minimum recommending the final solution, if not actually deciding on it, and being very clear about their executive support. If a vendor sales team doesn't see that or sense that, then they're going to go out and try to find the decision makers. And that's when a lot of the bullying can happen. So that's one thing, whenever Real Story Group is working on a team, we make sure that, look, we're articulating here that you are talking to the decision makers.
Yeah. And to me, the telltale sign I know something is wrong, as kind of buyers advocates that we play that role quite a bit. And when the people we're advocating for are getting undermined, right? And they
Yeah.
feel like they're getting cut out of the process, and just they're not being valued for their
Yeah.
opinions, and they're trying to do all the right things, and that's where it's really frustrating from where we sit.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's numero uno. I mean, underneath that, you'll see a lot of aggressive tactics, to pressure customers into making purchases or renewals when it's a poor fit or at a minimum without proper due technical diligence. So large MarTech vendors, will do this in particular. And, some of the intimidation is around like fear-based selling, misinformation, locking you into inflexible and overpriced contract. But I think you really pointed out what's the big one, which is really meddling with the leadership structure and intentionally kind of subverting the process and undermining some individuals. And there's, various phases that it can happen, right? Beginning even with like the initial sales process, right?
Yeah, no, and that's probably the most common spot we start to see the bullying is in the initial sales process. But I want to just be clear that it's not only during the sales process. The bullies don't go away after you select the product. Either the bullies from the vendor you chose or the ones you didn't, they're still going to lurk and see an opportunity there. But let's talk about the sales process, because again, we help a lot of companies select technology where our goal is to help them find the solution and partner that's the right fit for what they're trying to do. And what we've seen is the vendors who don't get selected for that don't like that, or don't advance throughout our process, our winnowing down process. They tend to take umbrage with that, and then they get desperate. That's where the desperation happens. I think back to this work that we did with one of the biggest airlines in the world, one of the biggest brands in the world. They actually came to us and said, we do not have an enterprise DAM. Which is kind of shocking that one of the biggest airlines in the world doesn't have an enterprise DAM, but they have assets all over their enterprise in a bunch of different pockets. And so they said, we want to go out and find the right enterprise DAM for us. And Tony, they did everything right. They had us come in and talk to more than 60 stakeholders. They had this really core selection team representative of the right people from across the organization. They had management support. They had everything. They went through this whole demo phase and bake-off phase and ultimately picked a partner to go with. But unfortunately, Adobe, who we had involved early in the process and didn't advance, got word that they weren't making the finals. And that's when their antennas got raised and they went above the heads of our stakeholders. And to make a long story short, it killed the project. They didn't get to go ahead with the vendor that they had selected. And I tell that story off the outset because this was over 5 years ago, and they still do not have an enterprise DAM because of it. They were all ready to go. Everyone's excited. Everyone's on board. And now they're just, we continue to talk to them. They're just so disillusioned based on what happened. It's kind of a shame.
Yeah, so that's an example where the MarTech team really kind of got disempowered there, not just during the sales process, but now 5 years later, they're not driving the sorts of value that they should. So there definitely was a business impact. Similar story at a major hospitality chain we were working with, who were consistently struggling with their web content management system, also from a major MarTech vendor.
Yep.
And the costs were going up every year, not just the licensing costs, but the professional services costs, primarily from the vendor. And they really wanted to put a stop to this, to say, look, we've got to figure out a different way of doing this. And the vendor kept going the back channel to the board member and the CEO saying, the reason why these costs are going up is because of your team. They're not managing this right, and so on and so forth. And that really wasn't true. Fortunately, there's a happy ending to this story that I'll describe a little bit later. They were able to organize a selection team and bump out the incumbent. But, this stuff happens, all the time. And I think it's worth kind of reflecting a little bit, before we get into the tactics, just a big picture, like Jarrod, why is this happening? Why are we seeing, so much vendor bullying now?
Well, for better or for worse, we haven't seen the consolidation in the MarTech space that we've been promised for 2 decades now, right? And so there's tons of competition. And from a buyer standpoint, that's great. I think competition is good for the market, but if you're a salesperson at one of these vendors with a lot of pressure and to hit your quotas, competition isn't always good for you. I think I also want to say that the we beat up pretty heavily or regularly on the large vendors when we talk about vendor bullying. And, of course, the big software vendors are all guilty of this, the Adobes, the Sitecors, the Salesforces, the Oracles, the IBMs, but it's the smaller vendors too. They get desperate too, because they're tired of getting pushed around by the big vendors and vice versa, right? So, we can talk in generalities here, but it is pretty pervasive across the board, with some exceptions. There are some really well-meaning salespeople out there. I don't want to cast a blanket statement saying everyone's bad, but we keep seeing it happen from some usual suspects, but it's really pervasive across the marketplace today.
Yeah, and again, we have to concede here that sometimes the problem is us, right? Like that we have the rise of complex stacks, and even though the composable stack model we believe has won and won decisively, at least in the enterprise tier, there's always a desire, especially at senior levels, to maybe simplify this. Can't we find, a single platform to rule them all, or failing that, a single vendor, and this will unify things? And if integration is always the big problem, which it always is, what if I got everything from a single vendor? Wouldn't that solve my problem? And those of you who are developers and architects know the answer to that is no. But, it's a very attractive sort of thing. But I think you hinted at one thing, earlier that's really critical here, is that the larger vendors, Adobe, Salesforce, to a lesser extent now Microsoft, Oracle, SAP, they're the older vendors, and they're hiding a lot of technical debt, and often very poor or mismatched acquisitions that have turned their own so-called suites or clouds into complete cluster truck, situations here. And so those are the ones that we would argue you have to be especially careful about. But let's we've been kind of talking in some generalities. Let's talk a little bit, like, what are some of the actual tactics that you've seen? Like, how would I recognize some common sales tactics, and then some head-on, sort of bullying that as a customer I should be aware of?
Yeah, well, the classic one is FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt tactics, saying, like, if you don't renew with us right now, you're going to lose all your data, all that content that you put in. It's going to be a real pain in the ass to migrate to a new system, and it might cost you your job, because by the time you get that all moved over, you're going to be, your business is going to be on to the next thing, and you're going to be pointing fingers at you. And so you should stay with us if you've got us as an incumbent. That we see that over and over again, and it's real. It's some real fear of our stakeholders saying, I know there's better stuff out there, but I can't just pause everything. And my vendor's telling me they're not going to make it easy to get out of here. And so that's a big one. The other one that we hear quite a bit along the same fear tactics is, they're telling us our competitors are using a better product, and we need to switch, right? And that they tell those stories like the grass is always greener on the other side. If you do something dramatically different, we'll help you get there, and you won't fall behind. And we all know the grass isn't greener on the other side. Almost never, right?
Yeah, but it's very sensitive. It can be a very powerful topic that your people in your industry are going XYZ. So if you don't, then you look kind of stupid potentially, or you get criticized on Wall Street. The other big one that we see a lot is kind of over-promising and under-delivering. So of course, this is rife in the MarTech world, but I think in particular, we see vendors like Salesforce, who, at least in our opinion, tend to promise features that don't exist, or Adobe will promise features and functionality that just isn't ready. And so this definitely is it bullying? Well, not really, except that when they go to your management, who doesn't always understand the details around this, it certainly can come off as kind of a misrepresentation. Yeah.
And then the last one that falls into this FUD category, I'll say, is just locking yourself into a contract that really puts you at a disadvantage. We see during the sales process, the first stab at an offer is always something that's going to lock you in for the long term. And it's very tempting as a buyer to go for that, because it's not easy to go through these processes, and you don't want to be doing them every year. And you say, gosh, if I don't have to think about this for another 3 years, 5 years, gosh, 10, I'm going to get some really good pricing with 10 years. The salespeople really like to lock you in early. And as a buyer, I can tell you, it's not always in your best interest to lock yourself in. It's actually shorter terms are better to kind of reevaluate on an ongoing basis.
Sometimes, I think, especially for pure SaaS vendors, the one thing you have to be cautious about, though, is, surprise price increases upon renewal. And there's various ways to negotiate around that. But we know one very large religious organization who had a web analytics solution from a major MarTech vendor we all know. And, the vendor stalled on the renewal. And then at the last minute said, it's going to cost you 7x more. Now, granted, they had gotten kind of a sweetheart deal to begin with, but still, to have to go and say 7x. And this is not, everyone who's done this knows that you can't swap out, your traffic analytics platform overnight here. So they were really behind the 8 ball here. And you never want to be in that situation, because the thing is that these vendors, although they talk about a personal relationship, the reality is that they are, like many companies, revenue optimizers, and they will try to optimize their revenue off you. So, there's certainly kind of a buyer beware. But I think, all that is what I would call kind of hardball sales. But I think if we say, okay, hardball sometimes goes into like the bullying, realm. But there is one thing, and that you mentioned earlier, that the real bullying comes from big MarTech vendors who have access to your leadership, and this was invented by Oracle, I think, at some level. Came right from their founder and CEO. To some extent, IBM used to do this. And there's at least kind of, I would say, three variants, I think, to this bullying strategy that we've seen. Certainly one that I've seen is to go above your head to the board or the C-suite, right? You tell them that the selection or the platform team that's driving the selection, they don't see the big picture. And I can tell you one story. It was a major media company in Canada that was trying to replace their email service provider. And this company, this organization, they had very large newsletters, multi-million subscribers from around the world to their newsletters. And it was very important for them. And they had some very specific things that they wanted around that, as well as other sorts of, email engagement, email marketing that they were doing. And so we brought in a large vendor that we all recognize, and the team, by the way, did all the right things. They built the use cases, built the test cases, test-based selection project. The big vendor came in, brought in a bunch of kind of non-technical people to throw up a bunch of PowerPoints when we were expecting demos. They brought one product expert in from France who seemed to know his stuff, but had difficulty kind of doing any kind of demo at all. Clearly they weren't doing well. And their rep said, well, none of this really matters. I mean, what we really need to find out here is what you're actually looking for. I know this isn't what you're actually looking for. Let me have coffee with your leadership, and then we'll come back and explain why we're the best here. So it was basically telling the selection team that had put together a test-based selection, you peons are worthless. We're going to go find out what's really going on with your leadership. And fortunately, in that case, this team was able to sort of show them the door and find another solution that worked really well for them.
Yeah. In today's day and age of LinkedIn, I think if you're on the selection team, you got to talk to your management, talk to your bosses, and say, hey, if we're following the process, keep them educated. But if you get contacted, make sure we send it through the right channels, because they will try to contact you. They'll contact the janitor if they can. It's amazing.
Yeah. And part of it too is that they may already be wining and dining board members. We've seen this with this hospitality firm that I mentioned. We've worked with 2 born digital firms. One had just IPO'd, the other was about to IPO. So they were immediately targeted because they either came into a bunch of money or had a bunch of money. and in both cases did need to modernize their stacks. In both cases, the large vendor came in and said, well, if you're going to be a public company, you want to use our stack, our entire stack. Just buy us and we'll solve everything. We'll modernize your whole stack for you. And, they fortunately, we helped them go through a test-based selection process where they kind of selectively chose the key pieces of what they needed to do. And, they didn't just dodge a bullet, they dodged a cannonball, because going with this vendor would have been a disaster for them and probably would have put them at a material disadvantage. So,
I think this is why we keep seeing, and maybe the bigger vendors are more repeat offenders in this conversation, is because they do already have relationships somewhere in that organization, right?
Yeah.
And whether you're already using their creative suite tools, or you're maybe using their workflow tools, and when it comes time to
or their CRM,
or their CRM,
we're using your CRM,
right?
So you have to use our marketing suite.
Right. So you want to add, and right. And they don't tell you that they just integrated that into their stack by putting their logo on it. They didn't really do any underlying changes to make it fit into the stack that would give you any benefit to your organization. Yeah. But I mean, I in today's composable world, really educating your leadership that a stack in the box option is probably going to cause pain at some portion of your organization. It's not a one-size-fits-all kind of solution in almost any enterprise that we see today.
Yeah, certainly in larger enterprises. Yeah. I mean, there are some mid-market where we see some, potential for that. But, and what's interesting about a larger enterprise too, is that it's not always just going to your boss. So we've seen a couple of cases where they'll go to other business units and say, if you're, we're giving you this enterprise license. So kind of Microsoft sort of innovated this, and now all the other MarTech vendors do this. So, well, we're giving you an enterprise discount. So if your marketing team doesn't select us or goes with a different solution and replaces us, your costs are going to go up. So this happened at a major financial services firm that had been using the most complicated web content management system on the planet from a big MarTech vendor. And it was causing them more headaches and more costs than they needed. They were going to go to a slightly lower tier, save a lot of costs, use those cost savings to drive a lot more innovation through their inbound channel. And basically what the vendor did was they went to all the other stakeholders that were including creative and others within the enterprise and said, your license costs are going to go up because your partners over here in marketing are no longer spending with us. And so that led to some frank conversations internally. Fortunately, again, we were able to coach the team through and they got to the right solution, but it was kind of a nasty, surprise.
Yeah, and the final bullying tactic that I wanted to call out today is something that I think you coined as the roof rack on the SUV, and that's where kind of they flip in a technology to the larger package and say, oh, well, why would you go somewhere else? You already have this in your arsenal.
Yeah, I mean, we see that all the time, and sometimes the roof rack is something substantial. So at Real Story Group, we're working with a major European travel concern, and they wanted to license a CDP. And it turns out, and this showed up rather late in the game, that a major European software firm had slipped in some basic CDP licensing and part of their email service provider package as part of a bigger data and ERP play. So you can imagine which vendor this was. It was a major data and ERP vendor that got in there and said, oh, by the way, for a few extra euros here and there, you can also get at least, some foothold into our CDP and our ESP. And then they said, well, we're the incumbent. So, you have to prove. So this delayed the procurement for like a year, and this was clearly going to be a bad fit. And we had to go back and prove that it was going to be a bad fit. It was a big fight. Would have been a significant problem, quite frankly, if they were stuck with this roof rack, right? Because this wasn't what they needed. And so, it was a real pain, and they almost got bullied into a really bad decision. So, we could go on and on about this. I think, probably if I'm a listener right now, I'm probably wondering, well, okay, I've heard that, I've seen that. Now tell me, Jarrod and Tony, what the hell do I do about it? How do I inoculate myself? What do I do, if this happens?
Yeah, well, the first one for me is, starts with that contract. You really have to be careful about accepting unreasonable contract terms, and don't just take what you're given as your only option. Just like if you're making a big purchase, like buying a house, you're gonna counter offer. You're not gonna take the first offer that comes across your desk. And as a buyer, you do have some power there, right? I think what I like to advise my clients on quite a bit is saying, don't wait to the end of a proper selection process to negotiate either. These salespeople from these vendors, they're good, they're slick, and they know the work and time and hours that you put in to go through this process, and they know they got you over a barrel if they're the leader in the clubhouse at the end of the day, and you're only dealing with them. That's a problem. Right. So you want to keep it as competitive as possible when you're negotiating. So that means early in the process, when you get the RFPs, proposals back, you're in your vendor demos, keep that negotiation going. Don't wait till you have a finalist in mind to start that negotiation. That's huge.
Yeah. The other thing is that once you are engaged, you really want to confront vendors when they're meddling. And we do this all the time. And you tell them, look, this is really bad. And tell the account owner and the account exec, we're not putting up with this. And very often they will back down, right? Like if you say, look, this is bullshit, I don't appreciate this is wrong. If very often it's unethical, and to tell them, look, we'll tell them, look, you're being unethical. This is a really bad mark on your brand. And, at that point, like they're just not used to a brushback. They're used to wanting, particularly larger vendors, are want to control the discourse, control the relationship, monetize the relationship, of course. And when you throw them that brushback, very often it works. But I think, the other thing though is that you do need to have a contingency plan in case the relationship turns sour. And that means, the smartest clients we work with, they're doing a 3-year review. They do a little bit of a marketplace study. They consider what would it be like to have to migrate. They run an RFQ with their existing vendor, which often leads to some interesting conversations and usually better pricing. So, definitely know your rights and negotiate, but also set a clear exit strategy.
Yeah, you mentioned that hotel client earlier, and I think the way that they came to us was like, they're raising my rates every single year, and I'm not getting anything of value out of those increases. What are we going to do? And then so they basically took the bull by the horns and said, we're going to the market, and we're going to see some competition out there. And they made their incumbent compete for the business going forward. And it's leading to some pretty surprising results from everyone involved. The other thing, too, is I would say, and you mentioned the 3-year review, which I think is great, but it's easy to get distracted when you're doing implementations and just owning a system like the caliber we're talking about. But I think the most savvy clients that we work with are the ones that are constantly staying abreast of what's going on in the marketplace, so that they're not caught off guard by their current vendor or offers from over the wall. But one of the strategies there is, obviously, we're a research firm. We love people when people read our research to stay up to date. But we also like when our clients meet with other customers of the same product. We run this MarTech Stack Leadership Council that meets quarterly. It's some of the biggest companies in the world kind of sharing in a vendor-free environment about what's working, what's not working. And I personally get so gratified when I see we do these what's in your stack exercises, and you see across the table some of the biggest companies in the world say, oh, wait, you're a Sitecore customer too? You're a Accenture customer too? You're an Adobe customer? You're a Salesforce customer? And then the conversations in the hallway around lunch and breaks get really interesting. Like, what are you paying for this? And what are they telling you this year? And those are amazing conversations.
Yeah. I think the other thing here, again, we face a world where sometimes vendors are going to be bullies, and so you can't expect them to suddenly revert and suddenly be nice. I mean, you have to consider alternatives, and the other reason for that is that we often see more pain in the MarTech space when you overbuy rather than underbuy. So you always want to consider smaller, more agile, potentially better fitting vendors. So it doesn't mean the vendor itself is too small or tiny, but there are any number of vendors underneath the Adobes and Salesforces of this world that can provide a much better fit for you. The key thing, of course, is, how do you determine better fit and better business model? And here's where, when this is going on, I think where we really focus on a particular strategy around making sure that all your conclusions are kind of test-based. And so a big thing, to circle back to sort of where we started, was establishing your business success criteria and testing those vendors and then measuring the results. It's amazing how much people don't test vendors. They're sitting here like comparing PowerPoints, or they're watching a demo, which is like, watching the car salesperson drive an automobile around the dealer parking lot. No, you need to go in and test and then measure the results. And this is important because not having those success criteria, that's a common attack vector among the Adobes and Salesforces of this world, is say, look, these, techie dweebs down here did this testing, but they're not really defining it in terms of business success, where here I am telling you about, you're going to get more revenue out of this or something. And usually that's bullshit. You're not going to necessarily get more revenue, but they have a good story around that. So you need to be able to, convert your requirements into actual, business impact. Now, you can still have kind of technical requirements, that have technical underpinnings. Like if it doesn't integrate well with your existing data fabric, then there's a very good chance you're not going to be able to drive the kind of results you want. But this is the way that you persuade the C-suite or your board members who are being regaled, is like, look, we can prove vendor X is going to drive much better business outcomes for, a better ROI for these reasons, and to be able to actually show them.
And regardless, if you're doing this for the first time in a real rigorous selection process, or doing those quarterly or three yearly reviews, or maybe a more regular review, always document the decision making of the team, because someone's going to come in later. Maybe it's new leadership. Maybe it's leadership that just forgot about the rigorous process that you went through, and they're going to start asking questions, and it's going to be your word versus someone else's word. And if you have the documents in place about the process you went through and the decisions that led you to make to go in a direction over another, I think those are invaluable. And so write everything down, save the recordings. It'll behoove you in the end. So, all right, Tony. So we've talked today about recognizing kind of the signs of vendor bullying. We've hopefully given everyone a couple practical things to put into their toolkit about how to combat these tactics. I just wanted to invite anyone who's listening today to share their stories about vendor bullying. Share the stories about those idealized process that got derailed, and share how you might have fought back too. How did you punch the bully in the mouth to get him to back down? And whenever we've written or talked about this in the past, this topic tends to get people going. So we hope that wherever you're listening to this podcast, subscribe, and leave us a story. Tell us what's working for you, where you're frustrated, and if you need help, if you need someone on your side to help fight those bullies, give us a call.
Yeah, that's right. And some of you, already may have gotten bullied into a bad decision, and you're sitting underneath more technology or a more expensive and complex set of platforms, a suite that's not really a suite, and you want to get yourself out. We can help you with that extraction effort. So, certainly feel free to contact us, and we're happy to see if we can't add you to yet another success story.
Yeah, and finally, you're not alone, right? We're having this conversation because we're hearing it on a daily basis from our clients, and it's not necessarily good, but that it's happening so prevalently. But it's there are others that can talk you through this, and you can share strategies. And we mentioned how we share those conversations on our council, and we're happy to put you in touch with some like-minded birds of a feather if that makes sense too. So don't hesitate to reach out if you need help navigating these waters.
Cool.
All right.
Yeah. So hey, before we ring off here, Jarrod, what are we going to talk about next?
Next episode, we're going to talk about one of the big trends we're seeing as it relates to our technology stacks, and it's something There's a lot of trends hitting us in 2025, but this is a big one, and it's in something, and it's not what you think. It's not necessarily just about AI. It's about, should you be headless, legless, or something in between as it relates to your MarTech stack. So we'll see you.
Yeah.
See you then.
It's a real juicy architectural topic, but it has enormous business impact and enormous customer impact. So looking forward to catching up with you then.
Sounds good.